you're not just a body walking around in the world. You are a spirit in union with Christ. And he says, in me, he says, I've spoken these things that you know. In other words, in me you might have peace. Even though we face things in the world, we're not just in the world. There's something on the inside of us. It's our spirit. The real you is in union with Christ. And he says here, be of good cheer. That's kind of interesting. He's, you know, that's like the last thing you want to hear when you're having problems. Cheer up. Oh yeah, well, easy for you to say. That's kind of, you know, somebody come along and say, well, cheer up. Well, that's not really what you want to hear, but you know, Jesus is qualified to tell us that because he says, be of good cheer, here is why I have overcome the world. Now that's just another way of saying that in the world you're going to have problems and pressure and tribulation, but you know what? I have overcome, or I'm bigger than anything. I'm bigger than whatever's causing you the problems and the trouble and the tribulation, and you're in me. So we're in union with... See, this is another way of saying... Paul said it a different way. He says, I can do all things through Christ that strengthens me. In other words, he could paraphrase and say, I can face anything, I can deal with anything that comes, because Christ strengthens me. Christ gives me strength. He gives me the strength to deal with anything that comes along. There is nothing that can happen in life that Christ doesn't have more strength than that to deal with it. And he's in me. That's what Jesus is saying. You're in me and he's in me. We're in him and he's in us. He says, be of good cheer, I've overcome the world. So what he's encouraging us to do is, first of all, recognize that he says, he just tells us, in the world there's trouble. In the world there's problem. But you know what? No matter what the problem is, no matter what the trouble is, you're in union with somebody who's bigger than that. And he says, I've said these things so that you'd have peace, to give you peace of mind, so that you can trust in him and have peace in that. Now, I mentioned the Apostle Paul a minute ago. I'd like to read something that says a similar message in Ephesians chapter 6. And I think it's good to read parallel passages that say the same things but in different ways. We get a broader or more rounded picture of it. This is Paul's concluding. It's interesting. That was Jesus' concluding words to his disciples before he prayed. These are Paul's concluding remarks to the Ephesians as he finishes this epistle in chapter 6, beginning with verse 10. And he begins, we know he's concluding because he says, finally. But like all preachers, when he says finally, he doesn't really mean it because he goes on for several more verses. That's the way we do it. Finally. And everybody goes, whew, he's almost done. But he goes on a little bit long. Anyway, he says finally, but we know he's meaning for this to be a concluding thought. Now look at what he says here. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Now, sometimes the way people try to encourage us and help us when we're having these problems and these pressures and these difficulties that we face in life, humanly speaking, people say, will sometimes say, well, just be strong, you know. And that's like saying, that's like somebody saying, cheer up. It doesn't really rub you the right way, you know. When somebody says, well, just be strong. Well, what I would, you know, tend to respond to that is, well, I don't feel very strong, you know. And the truth of it is, Paul is not here saying be strong. Notice he doesn't just say be strong. He says be strong in the Lord and the power of his might. See, it makes all the difference in the world. He's not telling you to buck up and, you know, and tighten your belt another notch and be a little tougher and be a little stronger. That's human thinking. That's human reliance. But see, we're not just human beings trying to struggle through life, facing it on our own. We're united with somebody who's bigger than who's stronger than us. Let's put it that way. Sometimes when you're talking to people, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but I have in talking to people who are, you know, a little bit reluctant to listen to or hear the Christian message or the message about they don't want to have anything to do with, you know, religious things. But what sometimes people will say is, well, that's just a crutch for weak people. Well, you know, I think if you go far enough through life, you're going to find out that you're not as strong as you thought you were. And that we're all weak people in certain respects. Now, but we can be strong, though, but our strength is not in ourselves. And Paul here says, again, let me read it again. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. That's like saying, you know, lean back on him because he's strong in the power of his might. Then he says, put on the whole armor of God. Now, when he says that, he's using metaphoric language. He's using figurative language to make a point, or to illustrate it for us, to help us understand a spiritual truth. He's using the analogy or the image of armor. See, the person inside the armor is vulnerable and could be easily, pierced with an arrow or struck with a sword. But when the knight puts on the armor, for instance, he's got something on the outside that protects him. He's weak, but he's surrounded himself with something that's impermeable, something that's strong. And that's the image that Paul is giving us. We're in him. And though we're weak, we're surrounded by him who is strong. That's the image he's giving us here. And he equates it to putting on armor. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. Now notice, again, let me call your attention to the word that he uses here, wiles of the devil. The word wiles means trickery or lies. He doesn't say that you may be able to stand against the powerful strength of the devil. He doesn't say the power of the devil. He says the wiles of the devil. Now, if you look carefully at things that Paul says and things that are said in the Gospels, you find that really the condition that we're in after Jesus has gone to the cross, Hebrews tells us this, that through death he destroyed him that has the power of death, that is the devil. The word destroyed there is in some ways a little bit unfortunate. That's in Hebrews chapter 2 where that's found. The word destroyed there is a Greek word katargeo, which literally means to deprive of power. It doesn't mean that the devil ceased to exist, but he's been deprived of power. Jesus gave a parable and told the same kind of story. He said, when a strong man is keeping his house, he keeps it all secure. But when one stronger than he comes along, he spoils him and spoils his goods. He defeats him. He overcomes him. And he's saying, I'm stronger than the devil, and I come along and defeat him, and all of his possessions, that's all of us, go free. That's what he's saying by that. So Paul here is not saying, you better watch out, the devil, he's got all this power. I don't think the devil's got any power at all, really, except one, his mouth, his words, his trickery, his lies. And I was a good friend of mine, Brad Hofen. Some of you may know him. Brad, do you know Brad? He used to go to Cherokee sometimes to speak at the church there, the Friends Church, I think. Brad's a good friend, and he used to come with me before he started his ministry to India, and we would go to the prison together, and we'd take turns. He'd speak, and I'd speak, or then I would, and he wouldn't. And I remember one time he was giving this illustration for the men there, and trying to make the point that we've got more power on our side than the devil does on his side, and he likened it to a football game. And he said, just imagine, on our side we've got God the Father, and we've got Jesus, he's the quarterback, and he had it all described here like a football game. We've got all this power on our side, trying to make the point that we've got more force and more power behind us. And I liked that analogy, but then when it was my turn to talk, I said, Brad, I like that, but there's just one thing missing from the equation. What you need to have on the devil's side of the field, you need to have them all blown over with a strong wind and flat on their backs and unable to get up. And then you got the ball and say, can you run down the field for a touchdown? The enemy's all laying flat on their backs with their shoelaces tied together and they can't get up. And you think, sure, I could run down the field for a touchdown if they're all laying on their backs and can't get up. But here's what happens. While we're running down the field, the enemy's all laying on their backs, can't get up. We're running down the field, they're laying there on their backs talking to us. And they say, you'll never make it. And we'll stop and listen. Wow, maybe I'll never make it. No, just ignore what they say. Just ignore the devil and his talk. Well, see, the devil, and I've said this before, and I've heard other people say it too, but the devil's never going to come along with a red suit and a pitchfork and horns and knock on your door. So I got something to say to you. Well, it doesn't come that way. You've got to recognize the kinds of things that he says. He doesn't appear to you physically. That would be easy. If he came along with red horns and a red suit and a pitchfork and the smell of sulfur and all that kind of stuff like in the cartoons, that would be easy. We would know to resist him and to not listen to him. He doesn't come. It's much more subtle than that. You sometimes think it's your own mind. It's thoughts and ideas and imaginations. Paul says, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of Christ. It comes that way. It's thoughts of discouragement. It's thoughts of giving up. It's thoughts of fear. See, God is never going to bring to you thoughts of discouragement. No matter what's happened in your life, even if you're a total mess up, He's not going to come and discourage you. He's going to come and encourage you. You see? God's thoughts are encouraging thoughts. It's the devil who brings thoughts of discouragement and fear and condemnation, those kinds of things. Those are his wiles. So Paul here is saying, put on the whole armor of God. Now, we're still talking about being strong in the Lord and the power of His might. And it has to do with, well,